By the light of a single lamp burning fish oil, a Highland woman could spin wool she had dyed with lichen scraped off the rocks with her own hands, rock a child in the box bed with her foot, and mind a pot she had filled out of almost nothing. And she had already been on her feet for 20 hours, and the men were away at the drove. Today we call one of those jobs a full-time career and hire out the rest. But hold on to this. Number 14 on this list was the skill that made one woman, on a black night in a storm, the only thing standing between a mother and the grave. And number 3? It was a sound, made only by women, that a whole people believed could free the soul of the dead from the body itself. History remembered the chiefs and the warriors. It almost entirely forgot the women who actually kept everyone alive. If a strength history forgot to name deserves remembering, subscribe. Now let's count down the 25 skills every Highland woman had mastered, the skills that truly kept the family alive. Number 25. She ran everything. Start here, because everything else rests on it. We picture the Highland man as the head of the household. But for months at a stretch, he wasn't there. He was away at the cattle drove, or the herring fishing, or the wars, or off cutting kelp on another coast. And in all that time, the woman did not keep things ticking over. She ran the entire operation. The land, the beasts, the crops, the children, the money, the decisions. She was the farmer and the treasurer and the head of the house, alone for half the year. She decided when to sow and when to reap, which beast to sell and which to keep back, when the family could afford to eat well and when it could not. The 100 hard choices a farm forces on someone, all of them hers and all of them carried alone. She was never the helper in this story. She was the one actually holding the whole thing up, which is exactly why history's habit of forgetting her is so strange. Number 24. Rationing the year. And the hardest part of running it was arithmetic, done entirely in her head, with lives depending on it. When the harvest came in, that meal in the gurnal, the great wooden chest, was all there was until the next harvest, a whole year away. There was no shop to top it up. So the woman had to ration it, day by day, meal by meal, judging how much the family could eat now against how many cold months were still to come, so that it lasted to the very end. And it very often did not. Getting those sums wrong meant hunger in the spring. She carried the whole family's survival as a running calculation in her mind, every single day of the year. Number 23. Feeding a family from almost nothing. And when the meal ran low anyway, as it so often did in the hungry gap of early spring, she had to perform something close to a miracle. Feed everyone from what looked like nothing at all. She stretched the last of the oats with nettles picked from the dike, with shellfish gathered at the ebb, with a little blood taken from a living beast and mixed with meal, with whatever the land and the shore would give. It was not cooking as we mean it. It was the skill of keeping a family alive through the weeks when there was, by any honest reckoning, not enough food to do it. And doing it, quietly, year after year. And she did it without letting the children feel the fear of it. The dread of watching the meal chest go hollow towards spring was hers to carry alone, hidden behind a calm face and a bowl that looked fuller than it was, so that they grew up never quite knowing how close to the edge they had lived. Number 22. Making light. The Highland winter is long and dark, and candles cost money the family did not have, so the woman made the light herself. She kept a cruisie, a little leaf-shaped iron lamp, filled with oil rendered from fish, with a rush for a wick, and by that small, smoky, wavering flame the whole household spun and sewed and lived through the dark half of the year. And she read that flame, too. A blue flame meant wind was coming, so bring things in. A spark flying off it meant news was on its way to whoever it flew toward. She did not just switch on the light. She made it, fed it, and listened to what it told her. Number 21. Her own purse. And here is something that surprises people. The Highland woman often had money of her own, earned by her own skill, and it could save the family. The eggs were hers. The butter she made, beyond what the family ate, was hers to sell. The stockings she knitted in every spare moment went to market, and that small, steady stream of her own money. invisible in every history book, was very often what paid the rent in a bad year, or bought the meal when the crop failed. The croft might be in the man's name, but the coins that quietly kept the roof over everyone's head were, again and again, hers. That was all before the men were even awake, and number 14 is what she did in the dark. Number 20. Carding. Now to the thing that clothed them all, and it began with a filthy job. A shorn fleece is greasy, matted and full of the hill. And before a single thread could be spun, it had to be teased and combed and carded, worked between two spiked boards, over and over, until the tangled wool became a soft, even cloud ready for the wheel. The oil and dirt of the fleece worked into her hands and stayed there, and a family needed a very great deal of thread, so the carding, like everything else, was never truly finished. It was slow, endless, hand-aching work, and it was only the very first step of a long chain that turned a sheep's back into a child's shirt. Every garment the family wore began with a woman's hands dragging the wool clean. Number 19. Spinning. Then came the spinning, and this is the one that truly never stopped. With a distaff of wool under one arm and a spindle, the dielgen, twirling from her fingers, and later at the wheel, the Highland woman spun thread whenever her hands were not doing something else, and often when they were. She spun walking to the shieling. She spun watching the children. She spun talking by the fire. The old saying that a woman's work is never done was not a complaint. It was a literal description of a life in which there was always more thread to make, because everything the family wore had to be spun by her, one length at a time. Number 18. The colours of the hills. And before that thread was woven, she gave it colour from the land itself. She scraped crotal, the grey-green lichen, off the bare rock with a spoon and boiled it to make the warm russet browns of the Tweed. She used heather and roots and flowers, each giving its own shade. The famous colours of Highland cloth were not bought in a shop. They were gathered off the hillside by women who knew exactly which lichen, which plant, which season gave which colour. She carried a dye chart in her head, and its ingredients grew on the rocks outside her door. Number 17. Knitting. Every foot in that family was kept warm by her needles. The Highland woman knitted the stockings and the hose that everyone wore, from the wool she had carded, spun and dyed herself. And she did it, famously, on the move, needles clicking as she walked the miles to the peats or the shieling, unwilling to waste even the time of walking. She could turn a heel and shape a sole without once looking down, her eyes on the path or the child or the beasts, the whole craft living in her fingers. Nothing was bought. The whole family was clothed, foot to head, out of a hillside and a pair of endlessly moving hands. Number 16. Sewing and making do. And she turned the cloth into clothes and then kept those clothes alive for years. She cut and sewed the family's whole wardrobe by hand, and then mended it and patched the mends, and turned a worn garment to hide the wear, and cut a dead man's coat down for a growing boy. A single good garment might pass down through 3 or 4 bodies before it finally became patches, and then rags, and then, at the very last, was worked into a rug for the floor. Nothing was thrown away while a single use remained in it. She was, in one person, the family's weaver, tailor, and repair shop, an entire clothing industry run from one stool by the fire. We're saving Britain's vanishing skills, one video at a time. Subscribe and stay for number 3. Now to the doors of life and death, where she stood alone. Number 15. The healer. Long before a doctor could be reached, and for most Highland families, a doctor could never be reached at all. The person you went to when illness came was a woman. The wise woman of the district held a deep knowledge of the healing plants, what to gather, when, and how to use it, passed down through generations of women, wrapped together with charms and prayers. She set the simple breaks, dressed the wounds, brought down the fevers, and eased the dying. She was the whole of medicine for a glen, and her knowledge, real, hard-won, and largely unwritten, died with the world that needed it. Number 14. And this is the one I promised you, the midwife. Of all the women a Highland community depended on, none was needed more or more desperately than the Howdy. in Gaelic the Bean Gluine, the woman of the knee. She was the midwife, and in a land of scattered crofts and no hospitals, every single person was born into her hands. Picture it. A black winter night, a storm coming off the sea, a croft miles from any other help, and one woman walking through it to a labouring mother, and then holding, in her own two hands and her own experience alone, the life of that mother and the life of that child, with no one to call and nothing to fall back on but her skill. She brought a whole community into the world, one hard night at a time. And when it went wrong, as it sometimes did, she carried that too. Number 13. Nursing the fevers. And when sickness swept a household, and it swept them often, the woman became the whole of the health service. She sat up night after night with the fevered and the failing, cooling them, dosing them, keeping them clean, willing them through the crisis. And she did it while still running everything else, and while trying not to carry the sickness to the well ones. There was no relief coming, no nurse to take the next shift. There was her, and the long nights, and whatever strength she had left. And if the sickness was one of the ones that killed, she was usually the one who knew, before anyone dared say it aloud, which way the night was going to end. It was expected of her, and she gave it, over and over, for a lifetime. Number 12. Guarding the newborn and the milk. In a world where so many babies died and so much could go wrong, a mother reached for every protection she had, and many of them were hers to give. She drew the cane, the encircling prayer, around a cradle, extending her forefinger and turning slowly sunwise to draw a ring of safety in the air. She knew the charms said to guard a newborn and the milk cow from the evil eye. At the start of February, at the Feast of Bride, she and her daughters made the little corn dolls and said the old prayers for the protection of the household and its beasts. Believe in it or not, this was how a Highland mother pushed back against a terrifying world, with ritual and words and the turning of a hand. Number 11. Laying out the dead. And when, in spite of everything, death came, it was the women who received it. It was they who washed and prepared the body, who dressed it and laid it out, who sat with it and kept the wake through the night. The same hands that had caught a child at its first breath closed the eyes at the last. The Highland woman stood at both doors of life, the one you come in by and the one you go out by, and she was never once allowed to rest in between. She opened the door of life and she closed it. And number 3 is the sound she made there. Number 10. The songs. The Highlands are famous for their music, and here is a truth that is rarely told. An enormous part of it was made and carried by women at work. There were walking songs for the cloth, and milking croons sung to settle a cow, and lullabies, and songs for the reaping and the spinning and the rowing. A vast sung library that measured out the rhythm of every task and, woven into the verses, carried the news, the gossip, the love and the grief of a whole community. A woman held hundreds of these songs in her memory and sang them into her children, and that is how the music of a people stayed alive. Not on a page, but in the daily work of women's voices. Number 9. The mother tongue. And with the songs, she carried the language itself. Before there was any school in the glen, the woman was the first and often the only teacher a child had. At her knee, a Highland child learned to speak Gaelic, learned its prayers, learned its manners, and learned the Sloan Ni Da, the recitation of its own line of descent, who it was and who it came from. The survival of the Gaelic language, for centuries, ran directly through the mouths of mothers, passing it to children by the fire. When people say a language is a mother tongue, in the Highlands it was the plain truth. Break that chain, take the children away, or shame them out of the old words, and a language spoken for 1,000 years could begin to die in a single generation, which is exactly what, in time, began to happen. Number 8. The everyday sacred. And running through all of it, like a thread, was a quiet faith that belonged especially to the women. There was a blessing for the kindling of the fire in the morning and the raking down of it at night, a prayer for the milking, a charm for setting out on a journey, a word said over almost every task of the day. When the folklorist Alexander Carmichael travelled the Highlands and Islands in the 1800s and gathered the great collection we call the Carmina Gaelica, what he was largely writing down was the daily spiritual life of Gaelic women, a whole world in which the sacred and the ordinary work of the hands were never once separated. Number 7. The web of the clashen. No Highland woman survived alone, and holding the community itself together was its own great skill. A female one. The women of a township minded each other's children, nursed each other's sick, shared the spinning and the shearing, and the heavy work no single pair of hands could do, lent and borrowed and remembered every debt of kindness. This web of mutual aid, invisible, unpaid, and run almost entirely by women, was the real safety net of the Highlands. In a land with no state and no charity, your neighbours were your welfare system, and it was the women who wove and kept that web. A woman alone with a sick child could send word along it and know that another woman would come across the hill in the dark to sit with her, because she had done the same once and would need the same again. Number 6. Standing at the door. And when the worst came, when the clearances began and the landlords sent men to burn the roofs and drive the people off the land that Dutchers had said was theirs, it was very often the women who stood in the front line. Again and again, in the records, it is the women who met the officers at the head of the track, who barred the factors from their homes, who tore up the eviction notices and faced down the police, with their men standing behind them. At Coigach and on Skye, and in glen after glen, the resistance had a woman's face. There are accounts of women driving off the sheriff officers with stones and clods of earth, of grandmothers snatching the eviction summonses and burning them in the fire, of whole townships of women turning out together to make the factors' work impossible for one more season. They lost, in the end, to the power of the state. But they did not go quietly, and they were not the meek figures history sometimes paints. And now the 5 that the whole Highland world truly rested on. Number 5. Everything from nothing. Step back and see the scale of it. A Highland woman fed her family, clothed them from the skin out, lit their home, healed their bodies, taught their minds and buried their dead. And she did nearly all of it from a hillside, a few beasts, and her own 2 hands, buying almost nothing and wasting almost nothing. The self-sufficiency that whole books are written about, the dream of living off the land, was not a project or a lifestyle for her. It was Tuesday. She simply did it, every day, because the lives of the people she loved depended on her doing it. Number 4. Endurance. And there is one skill on this list that cannot be taught, only born, and it was hers most of all. The Highland woman bore many children, in a world where a great number of them would not live to grow up. She nursed them through the fevers, and she lost some of them, and she laid those small bodies out with her own hands. And then she got up the next morning and lit the fire and fed the ones who were left, because they needed her. To carry that much grief and that much work in one body, for a lifetime, without stopping, that is a strength no monument records and no history quite names. But it was, perhaps, the greatest skill of all. Number 3. And this is the one I promised you. The keening. When death came, the women did something for it that we have completely lost, and it was a true art. The finest of them was the bean toirim, the mourning woman, an experienced elder, respected and even paid for her skill, who would raise the keen, a formal, wordless, sung lament over the body, a sound of grief shaped and controlled and heartbreakingly beautiful that the whole community joined and followed. And it was not only performance. Many believed the keening was necessary, that the sound itself helped the soul of the dead to leave the body and begin its journey. It gave raw, unbearable loss a shape and a voice, and made it something a people could carry together instead of alone. We fall silent and grieve in private now. They had women who knew how to cry the dead. Number 2, carrying it across the ocean. And when, at the last, the ships came and took the people away, to Canada, to the Carolinas, to the far side of the world, it was the women who carried the Highlands with them. Not in trunks, but in memory. They carried the language and the hundreds of songs and the prayers, and the healing law, and the whole way of being a people across the ocean in their own heads, and they sang it and spoke it to children born in a new land. To this day, some of the oldest and purest Gaelic songs on earth are remembered not in Scotland but in Cape Breton, in Nova Scotia, kept alive across 2 centuries and 3,000 miles by grandmothers who would not let them die. A song first sung to ease the work of women's hands on a Hebridean night 300 years ago can still be heard, note for note, from an old woman's chair in Cape Breton, carried there not by scholars or books, but by one mother teaching it to one daughter, over and over, all the way across an ocean. The culture emigrated in women's memories. Number 1. The keeper of the world. So here, at the end, is the whole truth of it. Everything the Highlands are remembered and loved for. The language, the music, the faith, the fierce and tender soul of the place was not kept alive, in the end, by the chiefs or the warriors or the bards whose names we know. It was kept alive by women. In the home, at the knee, by the light of a fish oil lamp, unpaid and unnamed and largely unrecorded, they carried the entire inner world of a people from one generation to the next, every single day, for 1,000 years. History remembered the men and their battles, but the world only stayed alive at all because, quietly and endlessly, a woman kept it alive. And it lasted, in the end, exactly as long as there was a woman somewhere still singing it to a child. Stand back and see it whole. We remember the Highlands for its chiefs, its clans and its battles, the world of men and swords and names carved in stone. But underneath all of it, holding every bit of it up, was the unremembered skill of its women, who fed and clothed and healed and taught and buried a whole people, ran the place when the men were gone, stood in the door when the officers came, and then carried the very soul of the culture across an ocean when the land itself was taken away. History kept the men. The world was kept by the women. So here is my challenge to you, and it is a gentle one. Go back, as far as you can, into the women of your own family, a great-grandmother and her mother before her, and find out what they actually did, what they carried, what they survived, what they made from nothing, what they passed down that reached all the way to you. Then come and say her name in the comments. Let's remember some of the ones history forgot, because this was never just housework. It was the quiet, endless, unbreakable labor that kept an entire world alive, and it deserves, at last, to be remembered. Subscribe, because next, we follow the men out of the glen while the women held it all together. The drovers, who walked whole herds of cattle 300 miles to market on roads only their own feet remembered. That story is coming.